Louis XIV of France. Even today, the mere mention of his name conjures visions of glittering halls, mirrored corridors, and a monarch who seemed more like a god than a man. His contemporaries called him Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, not simply because he was the center of political life, but because he embodied radiance itself. At just 23 years old, Louis was described as the most handsome ruler in all of Christendom, tall for his time, with rippling muscles sculpted by daily exercise. His posture alone commanded silence. When he entered a room, conversation stopped as though the air itself bowed in reverence. Foreign ambassadors reported that simply catching sight of him felt like beholding divine beauty in human form. Venetian envoys swore that his bright eyes, burning like two blue flames, pierced directly into the soul. His voice carried effortlessly across great halls, low and resonant, a sound that seemed to shape reality itself. The effect was intoxicating. Nobles from across Europe whispered that Louis was no mere king, but a living emblem of God's will on earth. He was not simply admired, he was worshipped. When he danced, courtiers swore the very marble beneath his feet trembled. When he rode at the hunt, they spoke of him as if Apollo himself had descended, thundering through the forests of Versailles. One ambassador even fainted after merely brushing the sleeve of his ceremonial robe, as if proximity to such perfection was too much for the body to bear. But there is a cruel irony at the heart of this story. For all the magnificence, all the golden light of his youth, Louis XIV would not die as the radiant Sun King. Behind the polished mirrors and jeweled robes, behind the meticulous theatre of divine perfection, his body was already marching toward ruin. What history books prefer to soften or omit entirely is the brutal reality. This same monarch who dazzled with athletic grace and intellectual brilliance would end his days as a bloated, rotting husk. His teeth would be ripped from his skull, his breath a stench so foul it emptied entire chambers, his flesh consumed by gangrene until courtiers fled the very presence they once adored. That grotesque transformation from a godlike specimen of monarchy to a decaying corpse trapped in its own body is the hidden tale that France tried for centuries to bury. It is the story not just of a man, but of absolute monarchy itself, dazzling in its illusions, horrific in its decay. And it begins with Louis at the very height of his power, the golden prince descending a marble staircase beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, every inch the image of immortal perfection. The young king did not yet know that beneath the glittering armor of ritual and illusion, cracks were forming, cracks that would one day split open, revealing the darkness within. This is the story of Louis XIV's rise and his horrifying fall, a tale that will strip away the perfume of history to show the raw, unfiltered truth. The Sun King, whose brilliance dazzled Europe, would die in shadows. To understand the myth of Louis XIV, one must first understand Versailles. More than a palace, it was a stage. Every column, every chandelier, every mirror was part of a carefully constructed theatre in which the king played the role of divinity made flesh. Versailles was not designed for comfort, but for spectacle. Its vast corridors, echoing marble halls and endless gardens were meant to dwarf visitors, to remind them that here stood a man above all others. On May 6, 1661, Louis descended the great marble staircase in a ceremonial robe weighing 33 pounds, embroidered with real gold thread. 5,000 courtiers and foreign dignitaries stood breathless. Venetian mirrors reflected his figure 100-fold, multiplying his godlike presence until it seemed the Sun King was everywhere at once. The afternoon sun streamed through tall crystal windows, bathing him in a golden light as though the heavens themselves had bent to illuminate his path. In that moment, Versailles was not a palace, but a temple, and Louis its radiant idol. His voice carried effortlessly across the chamber. Even standing 150 feet away, courtiers could hear every word, every syllable ringing with certainty. It was not just the content of his speech that mattered, but the performance, the deep timbre of authority that left listeners convinced they were hearing more than mere policy. They were hearing fate itself. When Louis looked at you with those burning blue eyes, it felt less like conversation and more like judgment. Hardened diplomats, men who had stared down armies, reported being unsettled by his gaze. Yet what made Louis most extraordinary was not simply his natural charisma, but his genius for turning life itself into ritual. Every gesture, from lifting a glass of wine to taking a single step through the Hall of Mirrors, was choreographed for maximum impact. The courtiers who surrounded him were not passive spectators. They were actors in a play where the king was both director and star. The rituals of court, seemingly trivial, carried immense weight. To hand the king his gloves was not a simple service, but a public act of devotion, a reminder that all glory flowed from him. The court understood this perfectly. They competed for the smallest scraps of proximity, knowing that a glance from Louis could raise their fortunes higher than gold, while his displeasure could exile them into obscurity. In this way, Versailles became not only a palace of splendor, but a machine of power. Louis did not need to threaten or coerce. He dazzled, and men willingly bent their wills to his light. But here lies the deeper truth. This theatre was not just for France. Europe itself was the audience. Foreign ambassadors sent home letters describing the intoxicating grandeur, reports that left other monarchs scrambling to match, even if they bankrupted their kingdoms trying. Versailles became the model for every court in Europe, from Vienna to St. Petersburg. Even in the Ottoman Empire, whispers of the French king's magnificence circulated in coffee houses, carried by merchants who had glimpsed the spectacle. And yet, beneath the glitter, the performance carried a cost. To maintain such divine perfection, Louis's life became a prison of choreography. Every move scrutinized, every breath staged, every ritual designed to conceal as much as it revealed. He was the sun, yes, but suns burn brightly even as their fuel is consumed. The illusion was dazzling. The world believed it. And for a time, so did Louis himself. But history has a cruel way of turning illusions to ashes. Louis XIV's youth was not merely golden, it was almost superhuman. At an age when most young nobles were still learning the etiquette of court, Louis had already surpassed his tutors in nearly every discipline. By 20, he spoke French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German with ease, switching between them in conversation as though the boundaries of language simply did not exist for him. His fencing instructors, veterans from Italy known across Europe as the finest duelists alive, admitted with grudging awe that their royal pupil could defeat them in combat. His strength and agility seemed inexhaustible. Ballet was his passion, not only as art, but as politics. To dance was to command the stage. To embody harmony and discipline in motion, Louis would perform for 6 hours straight, not a bead of sweat betraying fatigue. Courtiers gasped as he leapt, spun, and glided, his body moving like a divine instrument. And when the dance was done, he would retire to his chambers and write verses so exquisite that even the British ambassador, renowned for his icy reserve, was moved to tears. Few men in history combined physical vitality with intellectual refinement so completely. But Louis's appetites were not confined to art and exercise. His hunger for life was voracious. Records reveal he consumed 4 full meals a day, each a banquet by any other man's standards, followed by 3 additional feasts disguised as snacks. Yet his figure remained muscular, his movements sharp, as though his body defied the limits of mortal digestion. After a day of devouring wild boar hunted in the forests of Versailles, sometimes pursuing the beast for 8 hours without rest, he would still dance until dawn, energy unbroken. His memory astonished even those accustomed to royal brilliance. He remembered not only the names, but the personal histories of over 3,000 nobles at his court, able to recall the exact lineage and alliances of each. A baron might appear before him after years abroad, and Louis would not only greet him by name, but inquire after the health of his children and estates. To the courtiers it seemed less memory than magic, as if the Sun King's mind encompassed all of France. And then there was his allure. To men, his presence inspired awe and loyalty. To women, it was irresistible. Discreet palace accounts whisper that the young king entertained at least a dozen lovers every month, his conquests ranging from duchesses to chambermaids. Foreign diplomats described his charisma as supernatural, a magnetism that bent even the most skeptical into admiration. When he entered a chamber, conversations fell silent, hearts quickened, and even rivals found themselves unwillingly seduced by the sheer force of his being. This was the very essence of Renaissance ideals, body, mind, and spirit perfected into a single mortal frame. In Louis, Europe saw not just a man, but a vision of what monarchy could be when fused with beauty and power. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed he had transcended the limits of humanity itself. And yet, such brilliance comes at a cost. What blazes brightest burns fastest. The same appetites, the same excesses, the same pride that made Louis appear larger than life would one day drag him into an abyss of suffering. But in those early years, no one could imagine it. The Sun King was still rising, and his light blinded the world to the darkness that waited. Every morning, as the first light broke over Versailles, Louis XIV became the centerpiece of a ceremony unlike any other in Europe, the lever. It was not merely the king rising from his bed, it was the rising of the sun itself, and all of France bent toward its light. More than 100 nobles packed into the king's chambers each dawn, elbowing and whispering for a chance at the smallest role in the ritual. One duke might hand him his silk shirt, another his embroidered stockings, while lesser courtiers fought over the honor of tying his garters or adjusting his wig. What would elsewhere be private acts of dressing were transformed here into sacraments of devotion. To serve the king was to be sanctified by proximity. To be chosen for the smallest task was to secure favor, pensions, and influence for one's family. Some men, excluded for years, wept openly when finally allowed to hold the royal mirror or pour the water for his morning wash. For those left unchosen, shame clung like a shadow. The lever was no trivial pageant. It was the mechanism by which Louis controlled his nobility, binding them not with chains but with yearning. The coucher, the evening ceremony, mirrored the morning's splendor. As candles glowed in golden sconces and shadows stretched across the mirrored hallways, courtiers once again assembled. With hushed reverence, they watched as the king undressed and prepared for rest, their gazes fixed as though witnessing a holy rite. Even the extinguishing of his bedside candle became a privilege, fought over with as much ferocity as commands of armies. These rituals were more than vanity. They were calculated instruments of power. Louis understood something profound, that monarchy was theatre, and theatre required ritual. By turning the most mundane aspects of life into sacred ceremony, he transformed his body into the axis of the kingdom. Just as the Catholic Church used incense, vestments, and liturgy to reinforce divine presence, Louis employed silk, mirrors, and protocol to create the illusion that he was not simply a man, but a living sacrament of France. The courtiers played their roles with fanatical devotion. They did not merely attend, they performed. Each bow, each whispered compliment, each anxious glance toward the king was part of a carefully choreographed drama. To falter was dangerous, for Louis saw everything. His memory, razor-sharp, ensured that slights were not forgotten, and loyalty never went unrewarded. And Versailles itself amplified the spectacle. The Hall of Mirrors, that glittering corridor of glass and gilded frames, was not built for comfort, but for multiplication. When Louis strode through it, his image repeated endlessly, a visual metaphor for his omnipresence. Marble imported from Italy, chandeliers dripping with crystal, frescoes painted with celestial imagery. All of it proclaimed the same truth. Here walks the sun, and the world must revolve around him. Foreign dignitaries returned home with tales of this daily worship, spreading across Europe the myth of a king who was not simply obeyed, but adored. Other monarchs attempted to copy the model, but none could rival the sheer theatre of Versailles. For in France, power was not only political, it was spiritual. To kneel before Louis was not just to serve a king, it was to acknowledge the divine order of the universe. And yet, while courtiers fought to touch his sleeve, while ambassadors trembled at his gaze, behind the curtain of ritual, Louis's body had already begun to betray him. Beneath the silk, the paint, and the perfume, the first hidden cracks in this performance of divinity were forming. The sun shone brilliantly in the morning, but shadows had already begun to gather. For all the glittering perfection Louis XIV projected, the truth of his body was far less divine. Beneath the embroidered silks and powdered wigs, the Sun King was already waging private battles against discomforts he dared not reveal. Court physicians' hidden records, decoded centuries later, show that by his mid-20s, Louis required 2 or even 3 enemas each day, simply to relieve himself. His legendary appetite, 6 to 8 lavish meals daily, stuffed with roasted game, cheese, bread, and oceans of wine, was slowly poisoning his digestion. What the world saw as boundless energy was already maintained at terrible cost. His breath, even in those golden years, was described as intolerable. Courtiers noted the constant peppermint lozenges he carried, sucking them quietly between audiences to mask the odor. His skin, admired from a distance for its pale smoothness, was in truth oily and scarred by persistent acne. The thick layers of white powder and rouge were not cosmetic flourishes alone. They were camouflage, hiding blemishes from the scrutinizing eyes of courtiers. But the most fateful choice of all was Louis's refusal to bathe. To modern ears it sounds grotesque, yet in the 17th century such habits were not unusual. Many physicians believed water could seep into the body and weaken it, or worse, open invisible doors for disease and evil spirits to enter. To bathe was to risk corruption. Louis believed this wholeheartedly, allowing only his hands and face to be washed each morning. His body was wiped down with linen scented with rosewater or vinegar, but true immersion in water occurred perhaps twice in his entire life. What to us seems unhygienic was to Louis a declaration of strength. He was convinced his natural odor signaled virility and masculine authority. Where others might be embarrassed by sweat, he considered it the perfume of kingship. At court, this belief spread until body scent itself was treated as a marker of authenticity. The irony is bitter. The very conviction that reinforced his aura of power would one day usher in his slow decay. Already, faint shadows were forming at Versailles. Servants whispered of the king's unpredictable moods, his moments of discomfort disguised beneath the rigid mask of ritual. Behind the mirrors and perfumes, courtiers noticed he sometimes shifted uneasily on his throne, his digestion gnawing at him even as he projected divine control. But none dared speak of it aloud. To admit that the Sun King suffered ordinary human ailments was to shatter the theatre of monarchy. Better to play along, to bow, and to ignore the scent of peppermint masking rot. For now the golden illusion still held. Louis's charisma remained irresistible, his rituals untouchable, his power unchallenged. But history's cruelest stories often begin with the smallest cracks, and in January of 1686, a complaint so minor it seemed laughable would ignite a chain of horrors that transformed the most magnificent monarch in Europe into something scarcely human. The Sun King was about to begin his descent into darkness. On a cold January morning in 1686, Louis XIV summoned his physician with what seemed an almost trivial complaint, a nagging pain whenever he sat down. For a king who had danced through the night and hunted wild boar for hours without tiring, this minor discomfort hardly seemed worthy of notice. Yet the Sun King was no ordinary patient. When the body of a monarch faltered, the entire machinery of France quivered with unease. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the king's chief physician, examined the royal body with the confidence of a man who believed his position came from both science and divine appointment. Fagan, whose treatments had already killed more patients than the plague itself, diagnosed the condition as nothing more than hemorrhoids. A nuisance, yes, but hardly alarming. His solution? The same medieval remedies he prescribed to courtiers and peasants alike, enemas, ointments, and poultices. What no one yet understood was that this small irritation marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last 3 decades. Within weeks, the minor swelling grew, hardened, and began to bleed. The discomfort sharpened into stabbing agony, a pain Louis himself described as a red-hot dagger buried deep within him. By late January, he struggled to sit through council meetings without wincing, his usually commanding presence reduced to subtle grimaces concealed behind his regal mask. The court whispered, but quietly. No one dared suggest that the divine body of the king might harbor corruption. Illness in the monarch was a political danger as much as a medical one. If Louis faltered, so too did the image of France's eternal strength. And so the pain was downplayed, hidden behind perfumed curtains and silken cushions discreetly placed on the royal throne. Yet Louis's suffering could not be ignored by those closest to him. His nights grew restless. Servants reported him shifting constantly in bed, wincing when rising for the morning lever. The smell around him, once masked by peppermint and rosewater, began to change. A faint sour odor clung to his garments, subtle but undeniable. By February, the king himself confessed he felt unclean, though still he resisted any notion of serious illness. Behind the walls of Versailles, the politics of medicine twisted tighter. To admit ignorance was unthinkable for Dr. Fagan. To suggest the king required surgery bordered on treason. Instead, the physician reassured courtiers that the pain was ordinary, curable, even beneficial. A sign, he claimed, that the king's body was purging itself of harmful humors. It was the language of medieval superstition dressed in the robes of modern science. But the truth was far more dangerous. The swelling was no simple hemorrhoid. It was the first sign of a fistula, an infection burrowing its way through the king's body, soon to erupt into one of the most grotesque medical crises in royal history. The Sun King, who had once been the very image of perfection, was already beginning to rot from within, and the men charged with saving him were about to unleash tortures that would make his private agony a public nightmare. Louis XIV's life, once choreographed like a divine performance, now became a theatre of pain. Dr. Fagan, desperate to assert his authority and reassure the court, turned to the standard arsenal of 17th-century medicine, remedies that sound less like healing than punishments devised for the damned. First came the enemas, not a single one, nor a course of a few days, but dozens, icy jets of water forced into the king's body every morning and night. Over 6 months, records reveal that Louis endured more than 2,000 of these invasive treatments. Courtiers stationed outside his chambers whispered of the king's muffled groans as Fagin insisted that purging corrupted humours would restore balance to the royal body. The Sun King, who had once commanded armies, now lay helpless beneath the authority of syringes and buckets. When enemas failed, Fagin escalated. He ordered cauterization, long iron rods heated until they glowed, then pressed against the infected flesh. The palace echoed with screams that pierced even the thick curtains of Versailles. Servants reported that Louis bit down so hard on blocks of wood that his teeth cracked, though he never allowed the court to see his agony. Each day the Sun King presented himself in his robes, his gaze steady, his stride confident, as though nothing were amiss. But in the shadows of his chamber the air reeked of burned tissue and despair. Still the infection worsened, the swelling grew, the pain multiplied, and so Fagin resorted to bloodletting, the most common and deadly ritual of the age. 1/2 liter of blood drained daily from the king's veins, his strength sapped even as his body struggled to fight the infection. The contradiction was grotesque. A monarch worshipped as divine was reduced to a bleeding husk, his life force spilled into basins that reeked of iron and incense. Desperation bred superstition. Charlatans appeared at Versailles, whispering of miracle cures. Fagin, rather than dismissing them, entertained their potions: bull's blood mixed with pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy, even concoctions of animal semen stirred into wine. Louis, who had once embodied reason and grace, swallowed them all without protest, clinging to the hope that somewhere in this parade of horrors lay relief. By summer, the palace itself had begun to change. The stench clung to draperies, lingered in corridors. Diplomats arriving for audiences with the king reported queasiness and dizziness. Some fainted outright. The Sun King's body, still dressed in gold and silk, was betraying him, leaking corruption into the very air of Versailles. And yet, the ritual of monarchy continued. Louis sat through councils, his face powdered to hide pallor, his eyes flashing with the same commanding fire. He still danced on rare occasions, though his steps grew slower. To the public, he remained a radiant figure. Only those nearest him understood the truth, that the monarch of Europe was being tortured daily, not by enemies, but by the very physicians sworn to save him. The illusion was cracking, and soon the stench of decay would become impossible to hide. By February of 1686, Versailles, once the fragrant jewel of Europe, reeked of rot. The courtiers, who had once swooned at the intoxicating masculine scent of their king, now fought nausea when forced into his presence. The infection in Louis's body had begun to seep outward, releasing a stench that no silk curtain or gilded screen could contain. Servants whispered that the air in his chambers felt heavy, as though fouled by something unnatural. At first, the odour was explained away. Physicians insisted it was the smell of ointments and poultices, concoctions of herbs and vinegar meant to heal. But within weeks there was no mistaking it. The smell was putrid, sweet and sour, the unmistakable odour of decaying flesh. A Venetian ambassador confessed in a secret letter that he vomited into his kerchief after leaving an audience with the king. A Spanish envoy requested to conduct meetings outdoors, citing poor health as his excuse. Diplomacy itself began to buckle under the weight of the king's stench. This was not merely a medical crisis, it was a political one. Versailles had been designed as the beating heart of Europe, the stage upon which Louis performed godhood. Now the theatre was contaminated. Perfumed masks became common among courtiers. Some pressed scented cloths to their faces, Others stuffed their pockets with sachets of lavender or cloves. Yet even these defences faltered. The corruption clung to clothing, lingered in hair, and settled into the velvet cushions of the king's throne. Ironically, this decay only strengthened one industry: perfume. Louis had long adored fragrance, but now his purchases multiplied. Vast shipments of Bulgarian roses, Indian sandalwood, and Arabian ambergris were imported at staggering cost. Versailles became a perfumed fortress. Rooms were fumigated daily with burning incense, fresh flowers replaced every few hours, and bowls of spices positioned strategically along corridors. Courtiers joked darkly that Versailles was no longer a palace, but a giant censer. Yet even oceans of perfume could not drown the truth. The king's very body had become a source of corruption. The Sun King, who once embodied radiance, now carried his own darkness wherever he walked. The irony was unbearable. A monarch who had built the most magnificent palace in Europe to project immortality was being undone by the simplest of mortal realities: the smell of his own decaying flesh. Still, the performance continued. Louis rose for the lever, endured the culture, and appeared at councils with his powdered face and commanding gaze. The courtiers bowed, the ambassadors applauded, the rituals played out exactly as before. But beneath the choreography, everyone knew the illusion was faltering. The sun still shone, but its rays carried the stench of death. Something radical had to be done. And in the autumn of 1686, salvation arrived in the form of a surgeon whose methods were as brutal as they were unprecedented. Charles-François Félix would attempt to cut the rot from the king's body itself. Whether he succeeded or failed, Versailles was about to witness one of the most horrific medical spectacles in history. By late 1686, the Sun King's decay could no longer be concealed with flowers, incense, or ritual. The royal court was choking on the odour, foreign ambassadors whispered of a monarch smelling of death, and even the most loyal courtiers begged for a solution. Desperation forced Louis to turn away from Dr. Fagan's endless tortures and place his fate in the hands of a man both feared and admired: Charles-François Félix, the royal surgeon. Félix was no ordinary physician. He was a craftsman of the body, a man who wielded blades with precision in an age when surgery was considered little more than butchery. Unlike the court doctors, who spoke in lofty theories of humours and celestial influences, Félix dealt with reality: the knife, the flesh, the scream. His reputation was terrifying, decisive, uncompromising, and utterly unafraid of blood. When summoned, he knew the task before him was impossible: to operate on the most powerful monarch in Europe, without anesthesia, without antiseptic, and with the certainty that failure would mean not just disgrace, but his own death. Yet Félix did not hesitate. He began preparing in a way that horrified even his contemporaries. Using condemned prisoners and desperate volunteers, he performed dozens of practice surgeries. Week after week, he honed his technique on living human bodies, cutting, probing, and stitching as they writhed in agony. Records suggest he practiced on 75 men before he dared approach the king. In the shadowed chambers of Parisian prisons, cries of pain echoed as Félix perfected the cuts he would soon make into royal flesh. To his mind, their suffering was the price of ensuring France retained its sun. What he created was unprecedented: a specially designed curved silver scalpel built to navigate the most intimate and sensitive regions of the body. It was both delicate and brutal, a blade forged for one purpose: to carve into the festering fistula of Louis XIV. The very sight of it unsettled the courtiers who glimpsed it, gleaming like a holy relic of pain. For weeks, Félix studied the king's condition in secret, charting the swelling, tracing the infection, calculating each incision as though rehearsing a dance. He demanded absolute silence regarding his preparations, knowing that any rumor of failure would cause panic throughout Europe. Behind the perfumed curtains of Versailles, while nobles jostled for the honor of handing the king his stockings, Felix was planning an operation that would decide the fate of the monarchy itself. Louis, for his part, faced the ordeal with remarkable resolve. Though his agony grew daily, each movement a stabbing fire, each audience a performance through clenched teeth, he agreed to Felix's plan. Perhaps he recognized that his power depended not merely on politics, but on the illusion of invincibility. If rot consumed him unchecked, the myth of divine monarchy would collapse. To preserve the theatre of kingship, he would submit to the knife. And so, in November 1686, the stage was set. Versailles prepared not for a ballet or a coronation, but for something far darker, a royal surgery that would either save the Sun King or plunge him into eternal night. At dawn on November 18, 1686, Versailles awoke not to the sound of trumpets or courtly music, but to whispers of dread. Behind closed doors in the king's private chambers, a gathering unlike any in history assembled. No courtiers, no ambassadors, no velvet-clad audience, only a surgeon, a handful of assistants, and a monarch about to endure agony beyond imagination. Charles François Felix, armed with his gleaming curved scalpel, stood at the bedside of Louis XIV. The king lay stretched upon silk sheets, stripped of dignity, his robes replaced by simple linens. No anesthesia existed, no chloroform, no ether, not even crude opiates in sufficient strength to dull the torment. There would be no escape from the pain. 4 trusted courtiers held his arms and legs, while another pressed a block of wood between his teeth to keep him from shattering them with his screams. The first incision silenced even the bravest in the room. When Felix's blade pierced the fistula, a putrid spray of pus and blood erupted, filling the chamber with a stench so foul that 2 assistants fled vomiting into the corridors. Louis did not faint. He bit through the wooden block and roared, his cry echoing through the thick walls of Versailles like a beast in torment. Courtiers stationed 3 floors below later swore they heard the king's agony reverberate through the palace. For 3 hours, the Sun King endured torture no mortal should survive. Felix cut deeper, carving away diseased tissue, following the infected track as it burrowed toward the tailbone. His notes, hidden for centuries, discovered only in 2007, describe removing clumps of gangrenous flesh, some so blackened with decay that they resembled charcoal. Each slice released fresh waves of foul-smelling fluid, the corruption of years spilling into basins while attendants tried in vain to mask the air with burning incense. The king's body convulsed with every cut. Sweat poured from his brow, soaking the sheets. Blood spurted in crimson arcs across the silk bed, staining gold embroidery beyond repair. At 9:15 a.m., as Felix's scalpel reached the bone itself, Louis screamed, "Mon Dieu!" a cry that rattled even the hardened surgeon. And yet, he survived. By sheer willpower, the Sun King endured the unendurable. When Felix finally stepped back, his hands slick with royal blood, the courtiers loosened their grip, and the king collapsed into exhausted silence. 3 hours of conscious mutilation had passed, but Louis lived. The surgery was declared a miracle, a triumph of medicine, a testament to the king's divine strength. Courtiers rushed to spread the tale. Their monarch had faced torment greater than the rack or the battlefield, and triumphed. Sermons compared him to Christ, suffering in flesh, yet unbroken in spirit. Versailles breathed a sigh of relief, but the truth was far less glorious. The wound would not heal. Infection lingered, the stench persisted. What Felix had accomplished was not a cure, but the beginning of a new nightmare, one that would demand not 1 surgery, but 3 more, each more brutal than the last. The Sun King had survived the knife, but he had not escaped decay. If the first operation had been hell, what followed was a descent into something even darker. Louis XIV's wound did not close. Instead, it festered. The infection spread deeper, tunneling like a hidden fire beneath the surface. Each day, pus continued to drain, soaking through linens that servants hurried to change in silence. The court spoke of miracles, but behind the velvet curtains, the smell of rot lingered. Charles Francois Félix knew he had failed to finish the work, and so with grim resolve he prepared for further attempts. On December 6th, he cut again. The king lay awake as the scalpel reopened his wound, slicing through already traumatized flesh. 2 days later, on December 8th, another surgery. And on December 10th, the most brutal of all, 6 relentless hours of cutting, probing, scraping, while Louis remained conscious, his body pinned beneath 6 men, his screams muffled against yet another wooden block, clenched between his teeth. Félix's notes, preserved in secret archives, describe the ordeal with chilling detachment. He removed a great quantity of infected matter, including tissue so diseased it disintegrated at the touch. Attendants gagged at the smell. Blood poured onto the sheets until they were soaked crimson. By the end, the surgeon had cut away enough flesh to fill a large wine bowl. The human body was never meant to endure such punishment, yet somehow Louis did. When the final operation ended, Versailles erupted with celebration. Court physicians proclaimed the king healed, declaring it proof of divine favor. Pamphlets spread across France praising his fortitude. Clergy compared his suffering to Christ's passion. His wounds were seen not as weakness, but as sanctification. The monarchy itself wrapped his torment in the cloth of myth. But beneath the layers of praise, the truth remained horrifying. The surgeries had not restored Louis, they had mutilated him. The fistula never fully healed. Instead, it left a permanent passage, a grotesque tunnel through which feces and pus leaked for the rest of his life. The man once praised for his intoxicating scent now carried an odor that no amount of perfume could conceal, and worse still, his agony had only just begun. Though the wounds closed enough for him to walk, they never stopped draining. He lived in constant discomfort, his body betraying him in ways no ritual could disguise. Versailles became a palace of denial, its mirrors reflecting not divinity, but the desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that their king was still the radiant sun. Yet Louis himself refused to break. He endured, he ruled, he commanded armies and courtiers with the same steel gaze, as if daring the world to notice the decay beneath his robes. His survival, however grotesque, became another performance, one that convinced France that its monarch was eternal, even as his body proved otherwise. The Sun King had lived through torture few mortals could imagine. But survival came at a price. His body would never again be whole, and the palace built to glorify him would soon be transformed into the most elaborate cover-up in history. By the spring of 1687, Versailles had become less a palace than a cathedral of scent. Louis XIV, though alive, now carried with him an odor so vile that courtiers described it as death-walking. His permanent fistula leaked continuously, soiling his garments, his bedclothes, and even the gilded cushions of his throne. The Sun King, who once dazzled with natural vigor, was now trailed by the stench of corruption, and so an empire of perfume rose to mask what nature had unleashed. Louis spared no expense. Each year he spent what would equal more than $2 million modern dollars on fragrance. Ships brought Bulgarian roses, Indian sandalwood, Arabian ambergris, musk from Siberia, and citrus oils from Spain. Versailles became the beating heart of a global perfumery trade, its demand so voracious that entire industries blossomed to keep pace with the king's decay. The palace itself transformed into a machine of aroma. Bowls of flowers were replaced every 2 hours, their petals still dewy when servants carried them in by the hundreds. Specialized burners called cassolets smoldered in every chamber, filling the air with perfumed smoke. Courtiers carried hollowed-out silver pomanders filled with scented herbs, lifting them discreetly to their faces when summoned close to the king. Even food was infused with aromatic oils, roast pheasants glazed with orange blossom, wines steeped in spices, not for taste, but to disguise the foulness of Louis's breath. What began as necessity soon became culture. The French nobility, eager to flatter their king, embraced the fashion. They drenched themselves in floral waters and exotic oils until their clothes, wigs, and gloves reeked of roses, lavender, and musk. Foreign visitors marveled that Versailles smelled unlike any other place in Europe, a constant storm of fragrance that overwhelmed the senses. In reality, it was not luxury but camouflage, a desperate veil to conceal the rot of the man at its center. Ironically, this perfume revolution gave France one of its most enduring legacies. The reputation of French fragrance, refined, elegant, unmatched, was born not from beauty alone, but from the need to mask horror. The Sun King's decay spurred an entire industry that outlived him, shaping Paris into the perfume capital of the world. And yet, the illusion was fragile. No matter how many roses were plucked, no matter how much ambergris was burned, the truth seeped through. Ambassadors still gagged during audiences, courtiers still vomited in secret. The myth of divine perfection could not forever withstand the evidence of decay. Still, Louis clung to performance. He continued to appear in public rituals, perfumed and powdered, striding through mirrored halls as though his body were not betraying him with every step. He refused to let the world see his weakness. Versailles might have smelled of gardens, but beneath the flowers lay rot. The Sun King's light still dazzled, but the air around him betrayed the darkness within. And soon, the decay would no longer be hidden by fragrance, for his body itself was beginning to collapse under the weight of years and indulgence. In the early years of his reign, Louis XIV had been a vision of vitality, hunting for hours without pause, fencing with unmatched agility, dancing until dawn. But by the turn of the century, that image had crumbled. The same man who once moved with the grace of a god now required 6 strong men simply to lift him onto his horse. His transformation was not sudden, but it was relentless, a gradual slide from warrior king to lumbering invalid. The records are brutal in their precision. In 1670, Louis weighed a lean 165 pounds. By 1700, he had ballooned to 265. By 1710, his body had swollen to an astonishing 310 pounds. His legs, once firm from the hunt, thickened into swollen columns. His face, once sharp and striking, sagged into heavy folds. He waddled rather than walked, his steps labored and uneven. Portraitists, terrified of offending him, painted carefully from flattering angles, draping his massive body in flowing robes that disguised the truth. But foreign envoys were not fooled. One Russian ambassador sneered in his dispatches, "The French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a pregnant cow." The humiliation was immense. Thrones had to be rebuilt 3 times to bear his weight. Carriages were modified to accommodate his girth. Even his once beloved hunting expeditions grew rare, his body too heavy to endure the chase. The courtiers, who had once admired his strength, now whispered of his decline. Some even pitied him, though none dared say so aloud. But the decline was not merely physical, it was symbolic. Louis XIV had long embodied the grandeur of absolute monarchy, his body a metaphor for the strength of the state. Now, as his flesh expanded and his movements slowed, his empire too showed signs of strain. Wars drained France's coffers, famines ravaged its people, and the glory of Versailles seemed increasingly hollow. The Sun King still ruled with absolute power, but his body told another story, that even the mightiest monarch could not escape the toll of excess and age. Still, Louis refused to surrender the theatre of kingship. He continued to appear in ceremonies, his robes glittering, his wig towering, his gaze as commanding as ever. Courtiers bowed deeply, pretending not to notice the sweat on his brow, the trembling of his legs, the faint odor that clung to his person despite oceans of perfume. Every ritual became an act of defiance, a performance designed to insist that the Sun King's brilliance remained undimmed. But beneath the powders and silks, the truth was undeniable. The once golden body that had symbolized France's strength was collapsing under its own weight. And as if obesity and rot were not enough, fate had prepared yet another humiliation for the monarch who believed himself divine, a catastrophe so grotesque it would forever change how he ate, spoke, and was seen. The king's teeth were about to be torn from his skull. If the fistula had been a humiliation hidden beneath silk and incense, what came next was an agony no powder or perfume could disguise. In 1693, the royal physicians, clinging to their medieval conviction that disease stemmed from corrupted humours in the mouth, decided that Louis XIV's constant ailments could only be cured by extracting every single one of his teeth. The procedure was barbaric. No anesthesia, no sterilized instruments, only crude metal pliers, chisels, and hooks. The Sun King, 55 years old, sat in his chamber while surgeons went to work. One by one, they yanked his teeth from his jaw. The pain was indescribable. Eyewitnesses reported the king's guttural screams carrying down the corridors of Versailles. Blood streamed down his throat, soaking the lace of his nightshirt, splattering onto the marble floor. Courtiers waiting outside pressed perfumed kerchiefs to their faces, not only against the smell, but to block out the sound of their monarch's torment. Worse still, the surgery went catastrophically wrong. In their frenzy, the surgeons tore away part of the king's upper palate, leaving a gaping hole that connected his mouth to his nasal cavity. They fractured his jawbone in the process, leaving it permanently misaligned. From that day forward, every time Louis attempted to eat, bits of food and wine sprayed out of his nostrils. His speech grew slurred and wet, his words garbled by the echo of air rushing through the unnatural passage in his skull. Courtiers were forced to lean close to hear him, their faces inches away from the reeking odor of infection. Dignity disintegrated. The king drooled constantly, spittle running down his chin as servants hurried to dab it with cloths. Eating became a grotesque ordeal, not a banquet, but a spectacle of embarrassment. Once famed for his appetite, Louis now struggled to swallow without choking, his meals punctuated by coughs, leaks, and muffled groans. The irony was cruel. A monarch who had ruled Europe through performance, who had built Versailles as a theatre of immortality, could no longer control even his own face. His body, once a symbol of grace, had become a grotesque parody of kingship. Ambassadors described the sight with horror in secret dispatches, the swollen body, the fetid odor, the nasal voice, the drooling mouth. The illusion of divine perfection was shattered, and yet Louis refused to retreat from the stage. He still held councils, still received ambassadors, still walked through the hall of mirrors as though nothing had changed. His courtiers, trapped in the theatre of absolute monarchy, continued the pretense. They bowed, they applauded, they praised his vigor even as they recoiled in private. The fiction endured, but it grew thinner with every passing year. Louis had survived the fistula. He had endured 4 torturous surgeries. He had weathered obesity and now catastrophic dental mutilation. But the worst was yet to come. Versailles itself would be forced to transform into a fortress of deception, a palace designed not to glorify the Sun King, but to conceal the horror of his decay. The theatre of monarchy was about to reach its most grotesque act. By the dawn of the 18th century, Versailles was no longer just the stage of divine monarchy. It had become a fortress of illusion, a vast machinery designed to conceal the disintegration of its star. Louis XIV, once the radiant Sun King, was now a grotesque shadow of his former self. His body leaked pus and filth from the permanent fistula. His speech was slurred by the hole in his palate. His bulk strained thrones and garments alike. The smell, suffocating, inescapable, preceded him wherever he went. Yet the performance of godhood could not falter. Versailles adapted. Court officials devised a system of color-coded ribbons to alert courtiers to the king's condition. A red ribbon discreetly placed on the chamber door meant Louis was in pain, approach at risk. White meant the odor was tolerable, though perfumed masks were advised. Black meant catastrophe. The king was suffering violent leakage, and only the most essential attendants could enter. In this way, Versailles managed the monarch like a fragile theatrical production, ensuring the illusion never collapsed entirely in public view. Ceremonies were rewritten to disguise reality. The lever, once a 2-hour spectacle of glory, was shortened to 30 minutes to spare courtiers the full assault of his presence. The coucher, once a luminous ritual of divine repose, was modified so servants could discreetly change his soiled undergarments behind heavy curtains, shielding even the most loyal nobles from the sight of their king's degradation. Thick cloth padding was strapped to his body at night to contain the constant leakage, hidden beneath embroidered bedclothes that sparkled like sunlight. The palace itself was transformed into a perfumed engine of denial. Windows were opened in precise sequences to create drafts that pushed the king's stench away from visitors. 500 bowls of fresh flowers were replaced every single hour, their fragrance wilting within minutes against the odor of decay. 50 specially designed perfuming machines burned continuously, releasing clouds of scented smoke into the halls. Courtiers carried silver pomanders filled with herbs and spices, pressing them to their faces whenever the king passed. Some ladies of the court fainted during audiences, excusing themselves with claims of sudden feminine ailments, though everyone knew the truth. The lengths to which the monarchy bent itself bordered on the absurd. Portrait painters learned to capture only flattering angles, hiding his girth and slackened jaw. Architects calculated how air would circulate during ceremonies to direct the king's odor away from ambassadors. Tailors sewed extra layers into his robes to absorb stains. Every detail of court life became complicit in the concealment of a rotting body that could no longer sustain the fiction of divinity. And still, Louis insisted on performance. He appeared in councils, attended mass, and strode, slowly, heavily, through the mirrored halls that once reflected his golden youth. He demanded that the theatre continue, for to admit otherwise was to admit mortality. Versailles became less a palace than a prison of illusion, where thousands conspired daily to maintain the lie that their king was eternal. Yet no perfume, no curtain, no ritual could hide the truth forever. The Sun King's light still shone in the mirrors, but it flickered now, dimmed by shadows that no courtier dared name. And as the years crept on, the corruption within him grew worse, preparing for a final act so grotesque that even Versailles could not disguise it. By the summer of 1715, Louis XIV was 76 years old, a remarkable age for a monarch who had endured decades of torture, infection, and decay. Yet his body, long battered by obesity and disease, was nearing its final collapse. On August 11th, in the silent hours before dawn, The king awoke with a scream that startled even his most jaded attendants. His left leg felt as though it were being devoured from within, a burning fire creeping upward with every heartbeat. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, now aged and nearly blind, was summoned at once. He examined the swollen limb and declared it no more than sciatica, the predictable result of too much sitting. But this was no simple nerve pain. Within days, black spots appeared on the king's toe. By August 15th, the discoloration had spread across his foot. By the 18th, the flesh turned hot, swollen, and foul-smelling. Versailles began to fill with a new stench, not the sour odour of fistulas or rotting teeth, but something far worse, the unmistakable reek of gangrene. The disease advanced with terrifying speed. On August 22nd, the king's big toe detached entirely, falling off as attendants changed his stockings. Courtiers gasped at the sight of white bone protruding from the decomposing flesh. The blackness spread up his leg like ink in water, devouring skin and muscle until by the end of the month his shin was half consumed. The king's bedclothes were soaked with pus and fluid. The smell became so unbearable that servants fainted upon entering the chamber. It seeped into the corridors, into the gardens. Visitors reported detecting the odour of death hundreds of feet from the royal apartments. And still, Louis continued to rule. Even as his flesh rotted away, he signed decrees with trembling hands. He received ambassadors, forcing them to bow and breathe through perfumed cloths as they tried not to gag. His voice, once commanding, grew hoarse, rasping with the effort of speech as the infection crept higher. The Venetian ambassador wrote with horror, "The king is dying by degrees before our very eyes." The Austrian envoy called it the most gruesome spectacle I have ever witnessed. Europe watched with morbid fascination. Physicians from foreign courts travelled to Versailles, not to heal, but to observe. This was no longer just a medical crisis. It was a living autopsy of absolute monarchy itself. Letters flew across the continent describing the Sun King's decay in grotesque detail, a monarch rotting in slow motion while still clutching the reins of empire. Inside Versailles, the rituals of concealment reached absurd new heights. Curtains were drawn tightly around his bed, perfume burners roared day and night, filling the rooms with suffocating clouds of amber and rose. Attendants worked in shifts, replacing sheets every 2 hours, cleaning wounds that revealed not living flesh but raw, blackened bone. 20 servants laboured around the clock, many begging for reassignment, unable to endure the stench. But Louis would not abdicate, would not withdraw from the stage. To the end, he insisted on performance, even as his leg dissolved beneath him. His courtiers bowed, their eyes watering from the odour, pretending to believe that divinity still radiated from the broken body before them. The Sun King continued to shine, but it was the light of a star collapsing, a brilliance warped into horror. The final days were approaching, the gangrene was unstoppable, and soon the monarch who had once embodied the glory of Europe would face a death so grotesque it would haunt history forever. By the final days of August 1715, Versailles had become a palace of dread. The black tide of gangrene had surged past Louis XIV's knee, consuming his flesh with terrifying speed. Every attempt to dress the wounds revealed something more horrifying, chunks of necrotic tissue falling away, exposing bone beneath. The king's leg resembled not the limb of a monarch, but a battlefield injury left to fester. The smell, thick, suffocating, unmistakably death, clung to every corner of the palace. Even seasoned attendants gagged when lifting his bedclothes. And yet, the theatre of monarchy persisted. Each day, Louis was dressed in fresh linens embroidered with gold, his wig adjusted, his face powdered to disguise pallor. Courtiers still bowed as they entered the chamber, Even as they clutched perfumed kerchiefs to their noses, diplomats recorded the horror in secret letters. To approach him is to approach a corpse that still speaks. The king himself seemed to understand his end was near. On August 25th, his 77th birthday, he summoned his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to his bedside. His voice, rasping like sandpaper, struggled through the ruin of his throat. "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." It was perhaps the only moment of candor from a monarch who had spent his life cloaked in ritual and illusion. The words struck those present like prophecy. By the final night of August 31st, Louis's body was collapsing. Servants reported strange gurgling noises from his chest, the sounds of organs shutting down as infection spread. At 11 p.m., he cried out one last time, his voice breaking, "Oh my God, come to my aid, hasten to help me." The plea echoed through the chamber, raw and human, a final admission of frailty from a man who had claimed divinity. The next morning, September the 1st, 1715, the palace fell silent. At 8:15 a.m., Louis XIV's heart ceased. The Sun King, who had outshone all rivals, who had built the most magnificent palace in Europe, who had lived as a god in the eyes of his people, died in his bed, surrounded not by glory, but by the unbearable stench of his rotting flesh. But even death brought no peace. Within hours, his corpse began to swell grotesquely, gases from decomposition stretching his skin. Strange popping sounds echoed from within the body, terrifying attendants as they struggled to prepare him for burial. The infection that had consumed him in life continued to devour him in death, mocking the elaborate rituals of the court. Outside the chamber, courtiers whispered prayers and crossed themselves, but none could escape the irony. The man who had built his reign upon spectacle, who had staged his life as divine theatre, had exited the stage as a grotesque reminder of mortality. The Sun King's light was extinguished, and in its place lay a corpse so corrupted that even his funeral would become a nightmare. The final act had come, but the cover-up was only beginning. Death should have brought dignity to the Sun King, but even in death his body betrayed him. Within 6 hours of his final breath, Louis XIV's corpse began to decompose at a shocking pace. The infection that had consumed him in life did not stop with his heart. It accelerated. His belly bloated, his skin split, and fluid seeped through the shrouds meant to preserve his majesty. Doctors rushed to perform an autopsy before the body disintegrated entirely. The findings were ghastly. The left side of his body was black with gangrene, the throat muscles eaten away until only threads remained. His intestines were grotesquely distended, and inside them lay a massive tapeworm, writhing like some parasitic crown, mocking his reign. The surgeon Maréchal recorded every detail with clinical precision, but the report was hidden away, buried in archives for nearly 2 centuries. It was too monstrous for public knowledge. The embalming was a disaster. Assistants, gagging even behind perfumed cloths, struggled to contain the swelling corpse. The gases built so quickly that the coffin had to be sealed with extra layers of lead to prevent it from bursting. During the lying-in state, witnesses swore they heard popping and gurgling sounds from within the casket, as though the king's body itself refused to rest. The horror of his death leaked into the rituals meant to immortalize him. And then came the cover-up. Within 48 hours, Dr. Fagan's medical notes were burned. Felix's surgical records vanished for 300 years. The official announcement declared that the king had died peacefully after a brief illness, his body untouched by corruption. Versailles erased the evidence of rot with the same efficiency it had once masked his living decay. To the people of France, their monarch had departed serenely, his soul rising to heaven in the same divine perfection he had embodied in life. But the truth lingered in secret letters, in the horrified accounts of foreign ambassadors, in the whispers of servants who could not forget the smell. The reality was far darker. The greatest king in Europe had died like the lowliest peasant, consumed by filth, his body crumbling while his mind remained trapped within. And therein lay the cruelest irony. Louis XIV had spent his life building the theatre of absolute monarchy, presenting himself as God's chosen, the sun around which all must orbit. He had built Versailles as a monument to eternal magnificence, a palace designed to defy time itself. But time is merciless. No amount of gold, no ocean of perfume, no ritual of power could shield him from the universal truth of decay. The Sun King's legacy endures in architecture, in art, in the myth of France's grandeur. Yet behind the mirrors and the marble lies another legacy, the reminder that absolute power is powerless against mortality. Louis XIV, the radiant god of Europe, ended not in glory but in grotesque ruin. His reign stands as proof that the body cannot be conquered, that kings and peasants alike share the same final fate. And so, history remembers him in two lights, the dazzling monarch who embodied splendor, and the decaying corpse that horrified even his own physicians. The brilliance and the rot inseparable, forever bound together in the tale of a man who believed himself divine, but died as nothing more than human.